Somewhere online in the middle of 2026, a claim started spreading fast. An artificial intelligence called Grok had been fed a set of ancient Sanskrit texts describing flying machines, and what it found back was described breathlessly as shocking, even terrifying. Within days, the story had the shape of a genuine discovery, an AI cracking open a 2,000-year-old mystery that human scholars had somehow missed. The problem is, almost none of that framing survives contact with what actually exists in the historical record, and the real story here, the one about how a 20th century document ended up masquerading as ancient scripture, is in some ways stranger and more interesting than the myth itself. Let's start with what's actually old, because there is a genuinely ancient layer to this story, buried underneath the modern hoax that gets attached to it. References to flying vehicles do appear in classical Sanskrit literature, most famously in the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, two of the foundational epics of Hindu tradition, composed and compiled over a period stretching from roughly the 5th century before the Common Era through the early centuries after it. In these texts, the vehicles are called Vimanas, and they show up as celestial chariots, aerial vessels used by gods, kings, and warriors to travel across the sky, sometimes described as descending from the heavens in blazing light, sometimes carrying entire armies, sometimes simply ferrying a hero from one kingdom to another in the space of a verse. The most celebrated example is the Pushpaka Vimana, a flying chariot said to belong to the demon king Ravana in the Ramayana, later seized by the hero Rama, capable of expanding or shrinking to fit however many passengers needed to board it, and returning home under its own power once its purpose was served. Read as literature, these passages are exactly what you'd expect from epic poetry describing divine power. Chariots that fly because gods and demons in these stories are simply capable of flight, the same way they're capable of shapeshifting, summoning weapons out of thin air or crossing vast distances in an instant. Nobody writing the Ramayana was drafting an engineering manual. They were describing the marvels appropriate to divine and semi-divine beings in an epic tradition, in much the same way ancient Greek texts describe chariots pulled by winged horses, or Norse sagas describe ships that sail across the sky. Scholars of Sanskrit literature have generally read these passages as exactly that. Mythological imagery, not technical documentation. And for most of the last 2,000 years, that's how they were understood, inside India and outside of it alike. The turn toward reading these passages literally as evidence of a forgotten ancient aerospace program is a much more recent phenomenon, and it has a surprisingly specific origin point that most viral posts about this topic leave out entirely. In 1952, a man named G.R. Josier announced the existence of a text called the Vaimanika Shastra, sometimes rendered Vaimanika Shastra, which translates roughly to a treatise on the science of aeronautics. According to Josier, the text had been dictated between 1918 and 1923 by a man named Pandit Subbaraya Shastri, who claimed he was not writing the material himself so much as psychically channeling it, receiving the knowledge directly from an ancient sage named Bharadwaja, one of the 7 legendary seers of Hindu tradition. The manuscript that resulted ran to roughly 3,000 verses across 8 chapters, and it did not read like epic poetry at all. It read like a technical manual, complete with detailed diagrams of aircraft, descriptions of construction materials, and instructions for propulsion systems, including something called a Mercury vortex engine, said to generate lift and thrust through the controlled rotation of Mercury inside a chamber. This is the document that almost every viral post, every dramatic YouTube thumbnail, and now apparently every AI reanalysis story is actually talking about, whether or not the people sharing it realize it. It is not a passage from the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. It is a standalone 20th century manuscript produced within living memory of the Wright brothers' first flight that claims ancient origin through a channeling story rather than through any documented manuscript history stretching back before 1918. And when actual aeronautical engineers eventually got their hands on it, the results were about as far from shocking discovery as you can get. In 1974, a team of researchers in the aeronautical and mechanical engineering departments at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, one of India's most respected technical institutions, sat down and did what nobody promoting the text on social media seems eager to do. They actually tried to evaluate the designs on their engineering merits. The team was led by H.S. Mukunda, and their findings were published under the title A Critical Study of the Work Vaimanika Shastra. Their conclusion was blunt. The aircraft described in the text, they wrote, were poor concoctions, and the author showed a complete lack of understanding of aeronautics. Of the specific designs analyzed, including one called the Rukma Vimana, the study stated plainly that if the craft was taken to mean what the drawings and text actually described, it represented a decided impossibility. The proposed wing geometries were aerodynamically unstable. The Mercury vortex propulsion concept had no basis in physics capable of generating meaningful thrust. Several of the described mechanisms directly violated Newton's laws of motion, not in some subtle, ahead-of-their-time way, but in the straightforward sense of describing forces and effects that simply don't occur under classical mechanics as we understand it, then or now. Materials named in the text, alloys with names like Rajaloha, were never given actual chemical compositions or forging methods, making them essentially meaningless as engineering specifications. Even the proposed fuels, in some cases, involving mixtures with animal products, were noted to carry no meaningful calorific value for powering sustained flight. The IISc team went further than just testing the physics. They traced the actual provenance of the manuscript itself, interviewing people who had known Subbaraya Shastri and the man who transcribed his dictation, a scribe named G.V. Sharma. Based on that investigation and a linguistic analysis of the Sanskrit used in the text, the researchers concluded the document had come into existence sometime between 1900 and 1922, not thousands of years earlier. They also noted something structurally revealing. Unlike genuine historical treatises on aeronautics, which typically begin by laying out general principles of flight before working towards specific designs, the Vaimanika Shastra jumps straight into describing particular aircraft, as though the author already had a specific mundane image in mind, the kind of image someone living through the earliest decades of powered aviation might plausibly have absorbed from newspapers, magazines, and the general excitement surrounding early 20th century flight. That detail matters more than it might seem at first. The person who actually drew the diagrams accompanying the text, a draftsman referred to in later accounts as Elapa, was, according to researchers who investigated the material's history, familiar with the names and general appearance of contemporary machinery through his own local engineering education. In other words, the illustrations bear the unmistakable fingerprints of early 20th century industrial design sensibility, not some untranslated echo of an ancient technology filtering through a psychic channel. None of this stopped the Vaimanika Shastra from becoming a genuine cultural phenomenon over the following decades, particularly among writers associated with the ancient astronaut movement, the broader idea that advanced technology or extraterrestrial contact shaped human history in the distant past. The text found new audiences through authors who used it, alongside other similarly disputed claims, to argue that ancient India possessed an advanced aerospace program later lost to invasion, cultural disruption, or deliberate suppression. It became a recurring reference point in a certain strand of internet history. Content, the kind that pairs dramatic narration with sweeping claims about forgotten civilizations, usually with little engagement with the actual 1974 engineering critique that had already, decades earlier, worked through the material in detail. The debate resurfaced dramatically and publicly in January of 2015 at the Indian Science Congress, one of the country's most prominent annual scientific gatherings. A session was included that presented claims about ancient Indian aircraft technology as historically credible, drawing sharp criticism from scientists across the country who argued that a platform meant for peer-reviewed research was being used to legitimize material that had already been thoroughly debunked. Interestingly, one of the scientists who weighed in on that controversy was S.M. Deshpande, one of the original co-authors of the 1974 IISc study itself. He argued for a nuanced position, suggesting that claims like these shouldn't simply be dismissed outright without examination, since intellectual curiosity has genuine value. But he was equally clear that his own research, the very paper he'd helped write decades earlier, had already concluded the described aircraft could not fly and that the text itself ought be reliably traced to any period before the early 20th century. His co-author Mukunda was considerably blunter in his public comments, pointedly asking why, if the presenters at the conference were so convinced the ancient designs were valid, nobody had ever actually built a working model to demonstrate it. That question hangs over this entire subject even now, more than a decade later in the age of large language models. If a design genuinely described a functional flying machine, however primitive, someone somewhere would have built a scale model and tested it. Aeronautical principles don't require ancient wisdom to verify. They require a wind tunnel, or, in a pinch, a reasonably patient afternoon and some materials. Nobody has produced one in 50 years of the claim circulating. It's also worth noticing that this particular story didn't appear in isolation. Throughout 2026, a very specific genre of content has been proliferating across video platforms, built around a simple, repeatable formula. Take a genuinely old artifact or genuinely old text, run it through an AI system, and frame whatever comes back as a shocking revelation that overturns established history. The same wave of videos and articles that produced the Vimanas story also produced claims about artificial intelligence reconstructing the missing half of the Antikythera mechanism, the ancient Greek astronomical calculator recovered from a shipwreck, and separate claims about AI, reanalyzing the Roman dodecahedron, a small, mysterious bronze object found across Roman-era archaeological sites, whose original purpose has never been definitively established. In each case, the pattern is nearly identical. A real historical mystery, one that legitimate archaeologists and historians have genuinely puzzled over for years or decades, gets run through a large language model, and the model's output, whatever it happens to be, gets repackaged as a dramatic new finding rather than what it usually actually is. A summary or extrapolation built from the same publicly available research and speculation that was already circulating before anyone thought to ask a chatbot about it. That formula works from a content standpoint precisely because it borrows credibility from two different sources at once. It borrows the genuine mystery and age of the underlying historical subject, and it borrows the sense of authority and novelty that comes from associating a claim with artificial intelligence, a technology many people reasonably suspect is capable of things they don't fully understand. Put those two elements together, an old unsolved puzzle and a cutting-edge new tool, and you get a headline formula that performs extremely well, regardless of whether the underlying claim would hold up to 5 minutes of scrutiny from someone with relevant subject matter expertise. The Vimanas story fits that formula perfectly, right down to being one of a whole family of similarly structured claims released around the same period, several of them from the same clusters of accounts and channels. It's also worth understanding where the broader ancient astronaut framing around Vimanas originally came from, because it predates AI by decades and has its own well-documented history. Writers like Erich von Däniken popularized the idea, starting in the late 1960s, that many of humanity's ancient myths and monuments were actually garbled. Folk memories of contact with extraterrestrial visitors or a lost advanced civilization, and Indian Vimana legends became one of the recurring pieces of evidence cited in that broader genre of writing. Science fiction authors picked up similar themes. The idea took on a life of its own across popular culture, well outside of any serious archaeological or historical scholarship. That decades-long cultural momentum is part of why a text like the Vaimanika Shastra found such a receptive audience when it resurfaced in the mid-20th century, and it's part of why a fresh AI-flavored retelling of the same underlying claim finds an equally receptive audience today. The audience for this kind of story was already primed long before any chatbot got involved. Which brings us back to Grok, and to the actual claim that's been spreading online throughout 2026. According to the posts and videos driving this current wave of attention, Grok, the AI system developed by Elon Musk's company xAI, was asked to examine descriptions of Vimanas from these Sanskrit sources and reportedly surfaced recurring patterns involving the construction, movement, and materials described across the texts. Those reported observations spread quickly across social media and discussion forums, framed by many of the accounts, sharing them as evidence that an AI, unburdened by human academic bias, had spotted something real that traditional scholars had either missed or dismissed too quickly. It's worth sitting with what an AI language model can and cannot actually do in a situation like this, because it matters enormously to how much weight this kind of claim deserves. A language model reading a historical or pseudo-historical text can absolutely identify patterns in the language used, recurring vocabulary, structural similarities between passages, thematic, consistency across different sections of a document. That's a legitimate and genuinely useful application of the technology, the same kind of pattern recognition that's helped researchers analyze authorship questions in disputed manuscripts across many fields. What an AI cannot do is independently verify whether the physical claims made in a several thousand-year-old, or in this case, actually 100-year-old, text correspond to real, functioning technology. It has no way to test a mercury vortex engine in a wind tunnel. It has no way to date a manuscript through radiocarbon analysis or trace its provenance through interviews with people who knew the author, the way the IISc researchers did in 1974 with real boots-on-the-ground historical investigation. An AI's output is fundamentally shaped and limited by the material it's given and the framing of the questions it's asked. Feed it a text formatted like an engineering manual and ask it to identify technical patterns, and it will do exactly that. Describe the patterns present in the writing, without that description constituting any kind of independent confirmation that the underlying technology described is real or ancient or functional. That distinction between identifying patterns in language and confirming physical reality is precisely the gap that a lot of the viral framing around this story quietly erases. A headline promising that AI reanalysis of ancient texts revealed something terrifying implies a kind of verification that simply isn't happening. What's actually happening, as best anyone can tell from the public discussion around this, is that a chatbot was asked to summarize and highlight recurring descriptive elements in a document. The same document that a team of professional aeronautical engineers had already spent real time and real expertise tearing apart, point by point, half a century earlier, using tools and standards that remain entirely valid today. The physics hasn't changed. Newton's laws are exactly as binding in 2026 as they were in 1974, or for that matter, in the era the Mahabharata was actually composed. A mercury vortex chamber does not generate meaningful lift regardless of which system, human or artificial, is asked to read a description of one. None of this is to say the broader cultural fascination with Vimanas is silly or unworthy of attention. It clearly isn't, given how durably it has captured imaginations across more than a century now, from early 20th century spiritualist channeling through to today's AI-assisted social media posts. There's something genuinely compelling about the idea that a civilization's oldest stories might encode forgotten technical knowledge, and that fascination has inspired real creative work, from science fiction to aerospace. Adjacent thought experiments by engineers who enjoy exploring the metaphorical space between ancient myth and modern flight, without necessarily claiming the myths are literal blueprints. Some contemporary engineers have taken an explicitly interpretive approach, reading Vimana descriptions as poetic or symbolic language that might loosely parallel later concepts like optical camouflage, brain-computer interfaces, or advanced materials science, framed openly as speculative reinterpretation rather than a claim of ancient literal fact. That's a meaningfully different project from asserting that a psychically channeled 1918 manuscript is a genuine 2,000-year-old engineering document, and it's worth keeping those two categories separate, because a lot of online content deliberately blurs them together for the sake of a more dramatic headline. What the actual historical and scientific record shows, laid out plainly, is this. Ancient Sanskrit epics do describe flying vehicles as part of a broader mythological tradition depicting the extraordinary powers of gods and heroes in a manner consistent with how flight, transformation, and other marvels appear across the mythology of cultures worldwide. Separately, and more than 2,000 years later, a specific 20th century document claiming ancient psychically channeled origin was produced, popularized, and eventually subjected to rigorous engineering analysis by credentialed aeronautical researchers who found its designs scientifically unworkable and its language and structure consistent with early 20th century authorship rather than ancient scripture. That analysis has stood for 50 years without a credible scientific rebuttal or a single working model built to challenge it. And now, in 2026, an AI system has reportedly been asked to summarize patterns within that same disputed document, generating fresh, viral attention built on a framing that, examined closely, promises far more than pattern recognition and language can actually deliver. The myth of the Vimana endures because it taps into something people clearly want to believe, that the deep past holds more sophistication, more knowledge, more wonder than we typically give it credit for. That impulse isn't unreasonable on its own. Ancient civilizations really did achieve remarkable feats of engineering, astronomy, and mathematics that continue to surprise researchers today. But the evidence for those genuine achievements, whether it's the precision of ancient astronomical observatories or the engineering behind structures that have survived millennia, comes from careful archaeological and historical work, not from a single early 20th century manuscript dressed up in the language of ancient prophecy, and not from an AI chatbot asked to spot patterns in that manuscript's phrasing. Sometimes, the most honest version of a shocking discovery story is the quieter one. The machine didn't reveal a hidden ancient truth. It summarized a document that human experts had already carefully, thoroughly, and correctly explained wasn't what it claimed to be, 50 years before anyone thought to ask an AI about it at all. There's a useful habit worth taking away from this whole episode, one that applies well beyond Vimanas or Sanskrit texts or any single viral claim. Whenever a headline pairs the words artificial intelligence with a phrase like ancient mystery finally solved, or researchers left terrified, it's worth pausing to ask a very simple question. What, specifically, did the AI actually do here? Did it run a genuinely novel analysis, cross-referencing data, or applying a technique that wasn't available before, the way AI has legitimately helped in fields like protein folding or the reconstruction of damaged manuscripts through image analysis? Or did it simply read an existing, often already disputed text and describe what was already written on the page, dressed up in new packaging that makes an old and previously debunked claim feel novel again? In the case of the Vimana texts, the answer is unambiguous. The engineering verdict was delivered in 1974 by people with the actual technical training to deliver it, using methods that remain scientifically sound today. Nothing about running the same disputed document through a chatbot half a century later changes that verdict, no matter how dramatic the video title promising otherwise happens to be.